No slow lanes, do not lock knowledge in chains, do not take our rights away, to connect, communicate. No slow lanes, do not kill our innovation, do not let money decide our access to information. No slow lanes.
Welcome to Zine Your Research, the podcast series, where we're talking about zines in academia. I am Catherine Hicks, an Arts and Humanities Librarian at Tulane University. Today I'm talking to Teresa Clifton, Special Collections and Engagement Librarian at the Doris Z. Stone Latin American Library and Research Center, about zines in the Latin American region. So welcome. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I'm Teresa Clifton. I'm relatively new to the Latin American Library, so I'm somewhat new to this collection, but I'm very excited to talk about what we have and a little bit about the history of zines in Latin America.
Yeah. So I said we're talking about zines, but really this is a zine and chapbook collection, which I think speaks... And more, yeah. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so we have one collection in the Latin American Library and Research Center, which is called the Latin American Zine and Chapbook Collection. And as the title would suggest, it has zines and chapbooks. And some other things too, including cartoneras, which is something that we can talk about a little bit. But it's interesting because chapbooks are not necessarily the same thing as zines, and so there's sort of this spectrum of things that might be included in this collection. And part of the reason they're grouped together, because we also have published chapbooks that are in our circulating collection that are not part of this collection. Part of it is how we acquire them. So we purchase them in bulk from a book dealer who sells them as zines and chapbooks. And that's sort of why they're grouped the way they are in special collections. We do have another collection, which is the Collection of Brazilian Cordel Literature, which is in rare books. And we can talk a little bit about what Cordel literature is, but it's sort of a parallel tradition in Latin America. It has a lot in common with zines. So there are multiple places in the Latin American Library where you might find things that could be considered zines, that you might be interested in if you're interested in zines. And you'll find some other things along the way because they're not all zines.
They're not all zines. Yeah, so it seems we have like the super category of things that are not books in the Latin American tradition. So in the last episode, we talked to Agnes at the Rare Book Library about zines in the kind of Western tradition, but can you tell us a little bit more about the sort of bibliodiversity of the entire Latin American region?
Yeah. I'll do my best. Yeah. So bibliodiversity is a term that's used a lot when talking about Latin American publishing and sort of the texts that are coming out of Latin America. And in part, in the modern age, it refers to how... Yes, a lot of books are coming out of large commercial presses, the same as they do anywhere else. But there's also a really, really strong tradition of independent publishing, of DIY publishing. And there's also a presence in Latin America of ferias de libros. So these are book fairs. And there's a really strong culture around this where cities, universities, libraries will sponsor book fairs, which are sort of public, usually open air book markets. And the commercial publishers are there selling things, but so are their used book vendors, and also their stalls for zines, for more independently published things, for chapbooks. And so there are a lot of different types of texts and works of art that are circulating beyond just sort of commercial literature. But this is also something that you can trace all the way back to colonial history in Latin America. So in the Spanish colonies, at least, printing presses arrived pretty early, but in 1531, there was the Real Cédula in Spain, which dictated that publishing, printing, importing, or selling any works of fiction or literature was illegal in the Spanish colonies. And so obviously people were still reading literature, producing literature, sharing literature, and that was all now subversive because anything that went through a printing press had to be approved by the Inquisition. And so there's always been this tradition of people circulating materials on their own, finding sort of creative ways of producing literature, of, a lot of things circulated in manuscript, well beyond the advent of printing in Latin America. And so this is the sort of thing, it's a tradition that has been interrupted and has been combined with other traditions. So we have these a lot sort of parallel and intersecting traditions of DIY publishing in Latin America. And some of that was also very clear in the terminology used in Latin America. So obviously zines are a thing in Latin America. They're called zines or fanzines. So they're using the sort of US, or I don't know if it's European, words for it, right? But there's also other things too. And so this is sort of a tradition that has been added to what's already happening in Latin America.
That's so fascinating. So much of it is informed by colonialism, by these edicts by the Spanish government, which makes printing and bookmaking illegal. And so inherently making a book is an act of political rebellion in that sense, which is not something that exists in the U.S. tradition of zine making.
There's actually something interesting about that history, even if it isn't necessarily tied directly to zine culture now, is that a lot of people refer to sort of the urban history, especially the urban history of Latin America, as la ciudad letrada, which is a theory proposed by Ángel Rama, which is basically that when the printing press arrives in Latin America, this really powerful bureaucratic class develops. And this is how culture is dictated. It's criollos who are descendants of Europeans in Latin America who sort of take the written word as power, basically. And they use that to dictate what it is, what Latin America is, what the culture is, what the law is. And it's all through writing, it's all through publishing. And they have the backing of the Inquisition largely. And that's something that it started in the colonial period, and it continues. There is still this strong culture of bureaucracy, of the printed word being sort of the defining cultural characteristic, right? And so people have argued that zines, and in discussion with colleagues and things, zines and other sort of DIY publishing and the sort of bibliodiversity that comes out of Latin America is sort of the response to that. That publishing, that printing is not just for a ruling class, is not just for the people of European descent. This is for everyone. And that's why we have such a sort of large indigenous presence in the zine collection. It's this sort of taking back of the power of the written word. And in fact, there's a book that came out recently, I think, that is currently in cataloging. It should be in our circulating collection soon, called Comunidad Letrada. So it's instead of the lettered city, it's the lettered community. And so it's a sort of community approach to publishing and to sharing the written word.
Because it's a question of what comes first. Like, does literature, does media create the culture, or is it reflective of the culture? And that's I mean, I guess in a colonialist government you would want to argue the former, that they get to dictate what language you speak.
And there was a concerted effort of that too, of sort of importing European culture into Latin America, that continued through the 19th century for sure. And so there's always been sort of things around the margins of people trying to sort of insert their own culture, their own sort of things not sanctioned by the Inquisition.
Right, so, because even referring to the region as Latin America can be an imposition.
Exactly. It's very, very, very diverse, and so are the publishing traditions.
Right. We already talked a little bit about language. What it means then to resist a colonialist power in the colonizer's language, but then at what point does that language become your language? And it's the language you grew up speaking, and the language your whole family speaks, and it becomes the language of your community.
And then there's the sort of the next layer of that too, because a lot of the US Latino ones are in English and very conscientious of that, or they're, sort of trying to incorporate English and Spanish. And then a lot of the ones from Latin America too, there's several that are sort of very anti-US, because there is a sort of second round of colonization of imperialism, where the US is sort of a very oppressive force, that's especially in sort of countercultural traditions in Latin America, you're very conscientious of that, right? Like it's very present.
And language is, again, such a big part of that. The expectation that everyone should be able to speak English is then, like a third wave of burying indigenous languages under Spanish and now English as well. Yeah. Distinctions between different parts of Latin America are in themselves like limiting. I mean, the word zine is a very limiting temporal, like things that are older than the 19th century are really not zines, so we probably shouldn't call them that, but it's also just like a useful catch-all phrase, I guess, for the bibliodiversity of Latin America, but then also regional differences is also very limiting.
And I mean, distinguishing between a cordel, a cartonera, a zine, a fanzine, all of these different things, like they are different things, and there's a lot of fluidity between them. There's a lot of movement between these two. I mean, the traditions move across borders.
Right, or even a chapbook, even like a published chapbook that has an ISBN, which in the U.S. would really kind of disqualify it from being considered a zine. And it's not a zine, it's a chapbook, but it still fits in this super category of books that are not books.
And we have chapbooks that look like zines, and we have zines that could be considered chapbooks. So it's hard to know sort of where to draw the lines.
Amazing. So do you find in these, are we talking about regional differences or temporal differences? You have mentioned things like the cartonera. Or is it a combination of those things? Is it like zines are kind of all over Latin America, but only more recently? Or are like what are these different categories of things, and how do they exist in relation to each other?
Yeah, so I don't know the entire history. Zines definitely made an appearance as zines or fanzines, or sometimes webzines even. But fanzines showed up in Latin America in the 70s, and a lot of them were sort of incorporated into political movements, especially during times of dictatorships. This was a way of sort of, publishing, sharing ideas that went against sort of the dominant political ideology. So zines came in, the late 20th century, and are still called zines, and they take a lot of different forms now. They cover a wide range of topics, as I'm sure they do in other places. But at the same time, there are other traditions. So one of the huge collections that we have, the Brazilian Cordel literature collection, Cordel literature, or cordéis, these are pamphlets that are sold. This is exclusive to Brazil, pretty much. They're pamphlets that are sold on the streets in stalls, and they are called cordel literature, which means like string literature, because they hang from strings in the stalls. And those are primarily poetry. And these actually go back to like early modern times in Portugal and Spain, with something called papeles volantes, which is like flying papers. So it's papers like cheap literature that you sell in the open air, right? They kind of fly around a little bit. And so cordel literature is something that is separate from zines, but I actually brought some to show you.
Yes.
And so some of them are clearly, pamphlets. They're almost all poetry. A lot of them are sort of popular poetry about political topics. I have one that I didn't bring that's about the most recent presidential election, and it's this comical poem about the two candidates fighting each other. We have a translation of the Pardoner's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. And so it's pretty much anything you can imagine, but it's a way of sort of promoting literacy. It's also the intersection of published literature and oral tradition, because a lot of times the sellers of cordéis will actually perform them. They'll recite them or even sing them as a way of advertising what they have. But then some of them, like this, is a cordel, but it looks, I mean, if you saw this, you would think it was a zine, right? It's what I'm showing is a clearly photocopied booklet where the poetry is scanned, just chunks of paper that have been cut out and glued, right? And so this is a cordel because of where it is from and how it was sold. But there's not necessarily a huge difference between this and a zine. It's just sort of a parallel tradition in Brazil.
So also, we will have these things linked in the show notes. So if you want to check out what Teresa is talking about, you can look at some images and do a little bit of looking into what these things are. But I think one of the asked question when we're talking about zines is, what is a zine? And I think in the context of Latin America, it is an even more complicated question than it is in the US or even in Western Europe, because of this long tradition of DIY or radical book publishing.
Or even just cheap, accessible.
Yes, yeah. So we've mentioned some other things, the cartonera.
Yeah, so cartoneras are, they've become really, really popular in the last couple of decades. This is something that came out of Argentina during the economic crisis at the beginning, in the early 2000s. And cartoneras, it means like thing made out of cardboard. And it comes from the cartoneros, which were people who tried to earn a living salvaging cardboard to sell to recycling companies. And so they're books made out of cardboard, so they're sort of literal trash. And the way they were made is that people would buy the cardboard from the cartoneros to create these books. And it's sort of a way of promoting literacy, of sharing books at a time when people couldn't afford books. And this is something that has taken off. The example I brought is Guatemalan. And so this is now something that's no longer a regional thing. It was initially just very South American. And it's spread. We have several Guatemalan ones, actually. And yeah, so cartoneras they're very much in the same vein as zines. They're sort of made by whoever wants to make one about anything they want to make it out of. And it's very cheap. They're easy to disseminate, and the point is to share them. The point is to pass them around, to share them with people who can't afford, a published book necessarily. And so this is super interesting too, because cartoneras, it's come up a lot in collecting in libraries, because there are libraries that are now trying to develop huge cartonera collections. But something about cardboard is that it's very acidic, so it doesn't last. Especially if they circulate, and they're meant to circulate, they disintegrate within, a decade or two. And so this is something that's sort of a challenge in archives, and what do you do? And it's literature that might be supposed to disintegrate, right? Like there is this ephemeral aspect to it. Yeah, and there's also an environmental aspect. So this is one of the big themes that we see in a lot of zines coming out of Latin America, but especially in the cartoneras, because it's this recycled material. And the example I brought is called Animalicidio, and it is by Francisco Alejandro Mendez. But it's interesting because it and several in this series open with this sort of apology and acknowledgement. And I'll read it really quickly. Aquí le pedimos perdón a las selvas y a los bosques del mundo por este papel gastado. So it's here we beg pardon, we beg forgiveness from the forests and the jungles of this world for this wasted paper. And so it's sort of acknowledging that it's sort of bringing up this polemic of like, publishing is this a waste? Right. What purpose does this serve? And especially in this recycled material, like, was this box, this Nestle box, a waste to begin with? And is it now wasted as literature or not? Yeah. But yes, this is one of the other really strong traditions.
They're very cool. So what is in this cartonero? Is it poetry inside? Poetry. What are some more of these like themes that we see repeated a lot? And also languages, I think, would be another fascinating, like what languages are represented in these traditions generally, but also in the collection here at the LAL specifically.
Yeah. So in the Cordel collection, those are almost entirely in Portuguese. I think I saw a couple in English. So they've actually been used in Portuguese language classes here. So that's something that they can be used for. We have also a lot of our zines and chapbooks are obviously in Spanish, but we have one of the biggest components of our zine and chapbook collection is Latin America. We call it Latin America US, but it's like US Latine authors and artists. And so a lot of those are in English or in combined English and Spanish. So you don't necessarily have to read Spanish to enjoy our zine collection. And then we also have several in indigenous languages. So I brought an example. This might be considered more of a chapbook that is it's bilingual, it's Fasafas, it's Spanish and Cachiquel, so Mayan language. And so we do have, it's a theme that recurs in our collection of identity, especially indigenous identity. It's something that comes up in the cartoneras too, especially from Guatemala, about this indigenous identity, but also in sort of a modern, urban, international setting. What does it mean to create a zine or to create a cartonera, which is Argentinian, in urban Guatemala? And so sort of using languages and formats to play around with identity and to make comments about identity is something that comes up a lot in this collection.
Yeah, so you alluded a little bit to people in Portuguese, studying Portuguese language can use these zines. What else can this collection, do you think, teach people about it? What is the purpose of this collection, of bringing these things together outside of Latin America, here in New Orleans, and for what purpose? What can it show people about Latin America?
Yes, I mean, as a whole, I think that it has a really strong purpose in a library research center as a set of primary sources for things like countercultural movements, youth culture, really sort of ephemeral culture, and sort of it captures things that are happening in a particular moment in a way that's hard to do in traditional publishing because it's such a long process, because there's so much vetting that things have to go through. So this is a really clear way to see sort of a cultural moment without having to go through those hoops, right? And so this is something that you can see a lot of sort of different movements, very individual movements, but also a lot of these are published by organizations. So there's a lot of ideas of what communities are doing, what community interests are in different regions. So that's sort of the obvious thing, I think, but there's also obviously for language, as I mentioned, but then there's also definitely interest in terms of art, in what's in here. So a lot of our zines are art zines. So some of them have no text at all. There are a lot of photography ones. We have a lot of comics, and this is part of sort of the history of publishing comics and zines in Latin America. When there's an economic crisis, comic publishing drops off, apparently. And so a lot of that sort of transitions into zines, so they become DIY published. So now there are a lot of comic series that are published as zines. So there's a lot of art like that. And then also in the Cordel collection, most of them, like these two examples, most of them have woodblock printing covers. So if you're interested in printmaking, there's a lot there for sure.
Yeah. Also, this cartonera has a beautiful textile on it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So some of them are multimedia. Some of them also tie into, I brought a set of ones that are about Twitter. So there are zines that are about Twitter, and then they have a link to the creator's Twitter account. So that is not something that we're archiving. We're not archiving the social media. So there's still this sort of ephemeral and social component, even though we've taken the zine out of context. But there is a sort of link to, we have this paper object, and there are a bunch that have, Tumblr handles too. And so there's this sort of extra component to these two. So you can kind of see how physical printed objects interact with, what's online as well. And then obviously literature. Many of the items in our collection are poetry, poetry or songs. And so that's something that is really, really rich for study. If you bring a literature class in, give everyone a zine, have them analyze the poem. The Cordéis too there are certain types of verse that are usually used in those. And so it'd be really interesting to sort of take a look at what the literature is.
So is the collection being heavy in poetry, is that a result of collection strategy, or is that a result of a huge poetry tradition, or both? I
think there is a very large poetry tradition. I mean, they're generally sort of in independent publishing, there's a lot of poetry. I mean, chapbooks are huge in Latin America. And so I think that is reflected in zines as well. And then it's also part of our interests in the Latin American Library in terms of what we collect. And the fact that we're getting our zines bundled with chapbooks anyway. So I think there's definitely the way we collect them sort of highlights poetry for sure. Yeah,
I think this is fascinating from a zine perspective because buying books from Latin America is weirdly difficult. If you're not a librarian that buys things from Latin America, you may not know that often when we talk to Agnes, she can get zines in a more US-centered tradition by going to zine fairs and just buying them herself personally, or just like going off on a street and collecting them.
Yeah.
But getting things from Latin America specifically can be trickier, so you kind of have to go through these intermediary third parties, which can affect how things get collected and curated.
Yeah, I was actually reading about that recently too, because there are these zine festivals, but they're often also very ephemeral. Like they'll pop up kind of out of nowhere. There's not a lot of notice, or you have to be closely following things on social media to find out when and where they are. So even if you are trying to collect zines, actively, it involves a lot of travel, and it involves being sort of ready to go at a moment's notice, which is not something we collect a lot of other things. So it's not necessarily a priority. So we do rely on these third parties to sort of gather samples together for us.
It kind of makes the Latin American tradition feel much more alive, like it is much more organic and driven by what people are actually doing and interested in, whereas in the U.S., it might be more driven by like book collectors or libraries or people that are trying to gather them together in one place rather than people that are just trying to, I don't know, I love the imagery of the books flying.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah. What is the distribution models outside of libraries? Just people who are talking about, I don't want to keep calling them zines, because some of them are zines,
plus,
but not zines plus. DIY publications throughout Latin America. How do they circulate organically? What is the culture behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is through these fairs, festivals, protests too, obviously, and then social media. So definitely, like, there's such a tie to social media in so many of them. And then some are, like, things like the cartoneras that we have that actually have ISBNs, like some of them are clearly meant to be treated as books or as magazines and sold as such. But then we also have a few that have instructions for it and have this very sort of community focus. This is for a particular community, for a particular purpose, for a particular circulation. So I brought a couple of examples. This one is in miscellaneous. I'm not actually sure what country it's from, but it has on the back of it, it's called 500 años de deuda, so 500 years of debt, and I think it's about like the history of conquest and everything. And on the back it says, tan pronto esta obra haya cumplido su misión, intercámbiela, regálela, compártala, which means as soon as this work has achieved its mission, exchange it, gift it, share it. So it's like, get your message from this and then pass it on, right? And so that's part of the idea of like zines a lot of them are meant to circulate. But then I have a counterexample, which is called Si tocamos a uno, responden todos, and this is about self-defense, feminist self-defense. And so this is another sort of common theme of zines is like instruction, especially for particular communities. But this one on the front, it has a big warning that says, varón heterosis, no tenés nuestro consentimiento para leer este fanzine, which means cis hetero man or boy, you do not have our consent to read this fanzine. Wow. So it's, you're not supposed to read this, right? This is not for everyone. This is for a particular community, which is something that's particularly interesting when these zines are then collected in an archive. And we have them in special collections, so they're not circulating necessarily. They're not being passed around. They're not being exchanged. But at the same time, there might be a cis hetero boy that reads the zine.
Right.
Yeah.
So if people want to engage with this collection, what should they do?
So all of this is in our special collections. The Cordesh are in our rare book collection, and the zines and chapbooks are in special collections and archives. So to see any of them on your own, you're welcome to come. You need to make an appointment with our reading room. So you can just email lal@tulane.edu and set up an appointment to come see them. And you're welcome to browse them. We encourage browsing them because there are so many different interesting things in there. So you can ask for a whole box, go through the whole thing. And then also they're available for teaching. So you can also email us to set up a class session to look at them. And you might find some chapbooks in our circulating collection as well. But those are separate from our zines.
A treasure hunt.
Yeah,
Go
exactly.
for a treasure hunt in the LAL. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. And thank everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Slow lanes. Do not lock knowledge in chains. Do not take our rights away. To connect, communicate. No slow lanes. Do not kill our innovation. Do not
hope I got that term right. I think that's
No. Well, now it's a throwback.
Yeah.
You just laughed over there. I had a thought and then I lost it.